How did the Soviet Union, a global superpower with the world's largest army, a nuclear arsenal to rival the US, and control over Eastern Europe, lose the Cold War? Was it a military defeat, a political blunder, or something more complex? At the end of World War II, the Soviet Union was riding high. It had defeated Nazi Germany, gained control over much of Eastern Europe, and emerged as one of the two dominant superpowers in the world. Stalin's iron grip on the Eastern Bloc meant the Soviet Union held power, not just through military might, but through fear. But behind this facade of power, cracks were already beginning to form. The Soviet system was built on oppression, economic inefficiencies, and a one-party rule that stifled innovation and change. Perhaps the biggest reason for the Soviet Union's downfall was its failing economy. The system of central planning, where bureaucrats in Moscow decided what goods would be produced, led to chronic shortages of basic consumer goods. People waited in line for hours just to buy bread. Soviet agriculture was inefficient, and its industrial production couldn't keep up with the West. While the US economy surged, spurred by capitalism and innovation, the Soviet economy was stagnating. And it wasn't just about bread or clothing. The Soviets were falling behind in high-tech sectors like computing, which would soon become essential in both economic and military arenas. The Soviet leadership poured billions into its military, seeking to match the US missile, tank for tank. The cost of maintaining this massive military-industrial complex bled the Soviet economy dry. When Reagan announced the Star Wars missile defense system, the Soviets knew they couldn't compete. They were already financially overextended, and the prospect of having to spend even more to keep up was a nightmare. Meet the lineup of Soviet leadership in the 1970s and 80s, a parade of increasingly out-of-touch geriatric leaders who presided over a stagnant economy and a decaying political system. Corruption was rampant. Soviet officials lived in luxury while the people suffered. This growing disconnect between the elite and the masses only fueled dissent, especially among younger generations who could see how life in the West was improving while they remained stuck. And then came Gorbachev. Unlike his predecessors, Gorbachev knew the system was broken and needed reform. His policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, were meant to breathe new life into the Soviet system, but they would ultimately speed its downfall. Gorbachev was a reformer, but perhaps his biggest mistake was thinking he could reform a system that was, in many ways, beyond saving. His openness policy allowed criticism of the government, and once people had the freedom to speak, they wanted more than just reforms. They wanted the whole system to change. As Gorbachev loosened control, nationalist movements surged across Eastern Europe. From Poland to Czechoslovakia, the people rose up against their Soviet-backed governments. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, it marked the symbolic end of Soviet dominance over Eastern Europe. Gorbachev's reforms unintentionally unleashed a flood of nationalist sentiment, and once the Soviet Union began losing control of its satellite states, it wasn't long before the USSR itself began to fracture. By 1991, the Soviet Union was broke, its people disillusioned, and its military stretched too thin. On Christmas Day of that year, Gorbachev resigned, and the Soviet Union was no more. So why did the Soviet Union lose the Cold War? Was it the West's superior technology, Reagan's hardline stance, or the Soviet Union's inability to keep up with the arms race? In reality, it was a combination of all these factors. But if we had to point to one overarching reason, it was the Soviet Union's failure to adapt, both economically and politically, to a changing world. The centralized, authoritarian system that had once brought the Soviets power was ultimately what led to their downfall. And that's the real reason the Soviet Union lost the Cold War. Because, in the end, it couldn't change fast enough. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you want more mind-blowing history like this. And hey, if you learned something today, smash that like button too.